The most dangerous lies are the ones people tell themselves before they ever meet the person standing in front of them. The cool morning air drifted through downtown Richmond, Virginia, as office workers hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee and briefcases beneath a bright blue sky. It looked like an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that disappears from memory before sunset. But some days quietly wait for one decision to change everything. Victoria Bennett walked toward a federal administration building wearing a dark navy coat over a professional suit, carrying a simple leather portfolio beneath her arm. Her pace was steady and unhurried. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, yet something about her presence felt impossible to ignore. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Just before she reached the entrance, a voice interrupted the rhythm of the morning. "Ma'am, stop right there." Victoria slowly turned around and saw Officer Ethan Parker approaching from the sidewalk. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his expression confident, and his eyes already carried suspicion before a single question had been asked. Several pedestrians nearby instinctively slowed their pace. Ethan pointed toward the building entrance. "Where exactly are you going this morning?" Victoria answered calmly. "I have a scheduled meeting inside." Ethan folded his arms. "This area has restricted access." Victoria nodded politely. "I understand. I have authorization." But Ethan never asked her name. He never asked for identification. He never asked who she was meeting. Somewhere in his mind he had already created a story. Imagine standing there while someone decides your place in the world before learning your name. The breeze moved softly through the trees while government employees exiting nearby buildings exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria remained perfectly composed. No frustration appeared on her face. No anxiety entered her voice. That alone felt unusual. Most people would have become defensive. Most people would have tried to prove themselves immediately. She simply waited. Ethan interpreted her calmness as hesitation. In reality, it was discipline. He took another step forward and said loudly enough for others to hear, "People cannot just walk into federal buildings because they think they belong there." A subtle silence spread through the crowd. Victoria looked directly at him and replied, "I agree. Procedures exist for a reason." Ethan almost smiled, believing she was validating his actions. But several people standing near the glass entrance exchanged worried glances. A security employee inside the lobby suddenly froze after seeing Victoria. Another employee quietly reached for a phone. Tiny clues. Tiny reactions. But Ethan was too focused on proving himself right to notice them. Victoria adjusted her portfolio and looked briefly toward the federal seal above the entrance. Her breathing remained steady. Her eyes never left his for long. She did not announce her position. She did not ask for special treatment, because people who truly carry authority rarely need to display it. Meanwhile, the crowd had begun noticing something strange. The woman being questioned looked more comfortable than everyone else around her. The officer looked more certain than the facts in front of him. And somewhere between those two realities, the truth was quietly waiting to arrive. Because this was never going to be an ordinary misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a lesson an entire city would eventually remember. The man wearing the badge believed he was protecting the building. He had no idea he was standing face to face with the person who would soon teach everyone that dignity should never depend on knowing somebody's title. There is something unsettling about a person who remains calm, while everyone else slowly begins to panic. The morning outside the Federal Administration Building continued as if nothing unusual was happening, yet a subtle tension was spreading across the sidewalk. Office workers who had been rushing to their meetings were now slowing down to watch. Officer Ethan Parker stood confidently a few feet away from Victoria Bennett, believing he was simply enforcing routine procedures. Victoria remained perfectly composed. She adjusted her leather portfolio beneath her arm and waited, patiently without a single sign of frustration. That alone was beginning to attract attention. A woman carrying a laptop bag quietly whispered to her coworker, "Does she seem nervous to you?" Her coworker shook his head immediately. "Not at all." Ethan folded his arms and said, "Until I verify everything, you will need to remain here." Victoria nodded politely. "That is perfectly fine." Her answer was simple, but something about it felt unusual. Most people would have become defensive. Most people would have started explaining themselves repeatedly. She did neither. Imagine standing there while everyone around you becomes uncomfortable except the person being questioned. The cool Virginia breeze moved through the trees lining the sidewalk while the American flag above the building gently waved in the distance. Behind the large glass windows, several federal employees had stopped what they were doing. One employee stared toward Victoria for a few seconds before quickly turning to speak with a supervisor. Another quietly reached for a phone. Tiny clues were appearing everywhere now. Ethan never noticed them. He was focused entirely on confirming the assumptions he had already made. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, but somewhere along the way, instincts had begun replacing curiosity. Victoria calmly looked toward him and said, "Officer, may I ask you a question?" Ethan nodded confidently. "Go ahead." She smiled softly. "Did you ask who I was before deciding I did not belong here?" For a brief moment he hesitated. Then he quickly replied, "I am following procedure." Victoria nodded once. "Procedures are important. So are facts." Her words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Nearby, a man wearing an executive identification badge stepped out of the building and immediately froze when he saw Victoria. His expression changed from confusion to concern in less than a second. He quietly stepped backward and whispered something to another employee standing near the entrance. The crowd was beginning to notice a pattern. Every person who recognized Victoria reacted the same way. Respect. Concern. Urgency. Ethan still did not understand why. He looked around and assumed people were watching because of his authority. In reality, they were watching because they were realizing something he had not yet discovered. Victoria remained peaceful beneath the morning sunlight, almost as if she had already accepted where this story was heading. That was because she understood something everyone else was slowly learning. Titles do not create dignity. They only reveal whether dignity was present all along. Another supervisor emerged from the building carrying a folder and immediately stopped after seeing her. The atmosphere shifted once again. Nobody was whispering anymore. Nobody was pretending to be busy. Every pair of eyes was focused on the same woman standing quietly on the sidewalk. Because somewhere deep inside, people could sense the truth approaching. And with every passing second, Officer Ethan Parker was unknowingly moving closer to a lesson that would completely change the way he viewed every stranger he would ever meet again. The smallest clues are often the ones that completely change a story. Outside the Federal Administration Building in downtown Richmond, Virginia, the atmosphere had become impossible to ignore. What had started as an ordinary interaction was slowly transforming into something much bigger. Employees standing behind the glass windows were no longer pretending to work. Their eyes kept drifting toward Victoria Bennett. Some whispered to one another while others quietly reached for their phones. Officer Ethan Parker noticed the unusual behavior, but he interpreted it incorrectly. He assumed people were observing his professionalism. In reality, they were reacting to her presence. Victoria remained calm beneath the soft morning sunlight. Her leather portfolio rested comfortably against her side, while the cool breeze gently moved the edge of her coat. There was no frustration in her face. No fear. No urgency. Imagine standing in the middle of growing chaos while somehow remaining the calmest person there. That alone was becoming a clue. Ethan adjusted his stance and said, "We simply need to verify a few things before allowing access." Victoria nadit pelaitli. Verification is always important. The answer was so measured that it made several people nearby exchange nervous glances. A young employee exiting the building slowed down immediately after seeing Victoria. His expression changed within seconds. He quickly whispered something to a woman beside him before stepping back toward the entrance. Tiny reactions. Tiny signals. They were appearing everywhere now. Ethan still could not see the pattern forming around him. He had become committed to being right. That was the dangerous part. Because once certainty replaces curiosity, people often stop searching for facts. Victoria finally spoke again. "Officer, may I ask another question?" Ethan nodded confidently. "Go ahead." She looked directly at him and said, "How often do assumptions prevent us from learning the truth?" The question lingered in the air. Ethan replied, "Experience teaches us to recognize situations quickly." Victoria smiled softly. Experience is valuable when it remains open to new information. Several people nearby lowered their eyes because they understood exactly what she meant. Across the lobby, Another federal employee stepped outside carrying a tablet. The moment he saw Victoria, he immediately froze. His posture changed completely before he quietly turned around and spoke into a communication device. The crowd noticed. Ethan did not. The American flag above the building gently waved against the blue sky, while the city continued moving around them. Cars passed by. People hurried to work. Yet inside this small moment, time seemed slower somehow. Every passing second was adding another clue to a mystery that only one person had failed to solve. Victoria glanced briefly at the federal seal mounted above the entrance before returning her attention to Ethan. She was not trying to prove anything. She was observing. That was her strength. She understood something many people never learn. The way someone treats a stranger often reveals more than the way they treat important people. Nearby, an executive-level employee emerged from the building and immediately stopped after recognizing her. Concern flashed across his face before he quickly reached for his phone. The crowd became completely silent. At this point, everyone sensed that something significant was unfolding. Everyone except Ethan, because he was still focused on the story he had created at the beginning of the morning. And standing quietly in front of him was a woman who understood that truth does not need to rush. It simply waits until assumptions eventually run out of places to hide. The most dangerous trap is the one a person builds for themselves without ever realizing it. Outside the Federal Administration Building in Richmond, Virginia, the morning air felt heavier now. The crowd had stopped pretending to ignore what was happening, because everyone could sense that this was no longer an ordinary misunderstanding. Officer Ethan Parker stood confidently with his hands resting near his belt, believing he was still in control of the situation. Victoria Bennett remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm and patient beneath the soft morning sunlight. Her leather portfolio rested against her side while the breeze gently moved her coat. She looked more like someone waiting for a scheduled meeting than someone being questioned outside a federal building. That contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Imagine watching one person become calmer, while everyone around them becomes increasingly nervous. That was exactly what was unfolding. Ethan looked toward the entrance and said, "We have to prioritize security above everything else." Victoria nadid pelaitli. Security is important when it is guided by facts. Her answer was soft, yet several people nearby immediately lowered their eyes because they understood what she meant. Across the lobby, employees had gathered near the windows. One supervisor stepped out carrying a folder and immediately slowed down after recognizing Victoria. He did not interrupt, but concern flashed across his face before he quietly stepped back inside. Another employee reached for a phone. Another adjusted an earpiece. Tiny clues were multiplying every minute. Ethan still did not understand why everyone seemed so uneasy. He had become committed to defending his original assumption. That was the trap. Because once someone begins protecting an assumption, they often stop searching for the truth entirely. Victoria glanced briefly at the federal seal mounted above the entrance before turning back toward him. "Officer, may I ask one more question?" Ethan nodded confidently. She said, "What is more important, being right or being fair?" For a brief moment he hesitated. Then he answered, "Both matter." Victoria smiled softly. "They do. But fairness usually comes first because fairness creates the opportunity to discover what is right." The crowd became silent again. Nobody could argue with her words because she was not criticizing anyone. She was teaching them. Nearby, a woman wearing an executive identification badge walked outside and immediately paused after seeing Victoria. She quickly exchanged a worried glance with another supervisor. The atmosphere shifted once again. At this point, every person around them could feel that something significant was unfolding. Ethan could feel it too, but he still could not identify the source. The cool Virginia wind moved through the trees while cars continued passing in the distance. Richmond was carrying on with its day without realizing one important lesson was quietly being written on this sidewalk. Victoria remained composed because she understood something nobody else did yet. This entire moment was becoming evidence. Evidence about how institutions behave when they believe nobody important is watching. Ethan finally looked around and noticed that every person who recognized Victoria reacted the same way. Respect, concern, urgency. That realization finally planted the first seed of doubt inside his mind. Yet he was already too deep inside the story he had created for himself. And standing in front of him was a woman who never once tried to prove her worth, because she already understood something far more powerful than authority itself. Real dignity never rushes to announce who it is. It simply waits until assumptions become impossible to defend. The truth was already standing in plain sight, but nobody had learned how to recognize it yet. Outside the Federal Administration Building in Richmond, Virginia, the atmosphere had shifted again. Officer Ethan Parker could finally feel that something was changing around him, even if he could not explain why. Employees continued glancing through the windows while supervisors quietly moved from one office to another carrying folders and tablets. Victoria Bennett remained exactly where she had been from the beginning. Calm, patient, unshaken. The cool morning breeze moved through her dark coat while sunlight reflected against the glass entrance behind her. Imagine watching an entire building react to one person while that person remains completely at peace. That was becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan looked toward the entrance and said, "Everyone seems unusually concerned this morning." Victoria nodded once. Sometimes people become concerned when they realize they have overlooked something important. He frowned slightly. What exactly have they overlooked? She smiled softly but did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the building and said, "That is what today is supposed to reveal." Her response created another moment of silence. Nearby, an executive-level employee exited the building carrying a secured folder and immediately stopped after seeing Victoria. His posture changed at once. He approached slowly before speaking with careful professionalism. "Good morning, ma'am. We are preparing everything now."
Victoria nadit pelaitli.
"Thank you." Ethan watched the interaction closely. The employee never looked nervous around her. He looked respectful. There was a difference. Across the lobby, several federal employees gathered around a screen displaying schedules and documents. A woman quietly whispered to her colleague, "She is here earlier than expected." Another employee quickly adjusted his identification badge and hurried toward an office. Tiny reactions were becoming a pattern now. Ethan could finally see it. Victoria then turned toward him and said something unexpected. "Officer, may I share something with you?" He nodded. "For several months, I have been traveling to cities across the country. Every location receives the same opportunity." Ethan looked confused. Opportunity for what?
Victoria answered gently.
To demonstrate how institutions treat people before they know who they are. His expression changed slightly. He was beginning to understand that this morning was connected to something much larger than a simple misunderstanding. She continued, "My work is not about catching people making mistakes. It is about identifying habits before those habits become culture." The words settled heavily in the air. Nearby, several employees quietly listened while pretending to continue their duties. Nobody interrupted because everyone understood the importance of what she was saying. Ethan asked, "So this was planned?"
Victoria nadit calmly.
The evaluation was planned. The choices people made were their own. That sentence hit him immediately. Nothing this morning had been forced. Nobody had instructed him to make assumptions. Nobody had prevented him from asking questions first. Every decision had belonged entirely to him. The American flag above the building gently moved against the bright blue sky while Richmond carried on around them. Cars passed by. People headed to work. Yet one invisible lesson was quietly transforming into something much bigger than one encounter. Victoria looked toward the building entrance and took a slow breath. Very soon, everyone would understand exactly why she was there. But even now, before any title had been revealed, she hoped they would learn the most important lesson first. A person's dignity should never have to wait for their identity to arrive. The moment truth arrives, it rarely announces itself with noise. It simply removes every place where assumptions can hide. Outside the Federal Administration Building, the atmosphere had become completely different. Officer Ethan Parker no longer felt confident. For the first time that morning, he looked around and realized he was the only person who still did not understand the entire situation. Victoria Bennett remained calm beneath the bright Virginia sky, while several supervisors quietly gathered near the entrance. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody rushed her. They simply waited. Imagine discovering that everyone else has already recognized the truth, while you are still holding on to the story you created for yourself. Victoria adjusted her leather portfolio and turned toward Ethan. Her voice remained gentle. "Officer, thank you for your patience this morning." He nodded awkwardly. "I still do not understand why everyone is reacting this way." She smiled softly. "You are about to." One of the senior administrators approached carrying a secure folder and stood respectfully beside her. "Good morning, Director Bennett," he said. The entire sidewalk became silent. Ethan blinked twice, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Director Bennett."
Victoria Nadith Pelaitli.
"Thank you." The administrator continued. "The National Accountability Review team is assembled and ready for your briefing." Ethan could feel his heart sink. Victoria slowly reached into her coat and removed a black credential holder. She opened it carefully and held it where he could see it clearly. The official federal seal reflected against the morning sunlight. Below it were the words that instantly changed everything. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Chief Director Victoria Bennett. Time seemed to stop. Cars still moved through the streets. People still walked down the sidewalks. But inside Ethan's mind, every decision he had made that morning replayed itself all at once. Every assumption, every interruption, every missed opportunity to simply ask a question first. Victoria closed the credential holder and returned it to her pocket. There was no anger in her face. No satisfaction. Only calm professionalism. "I have been leading a nationwide initiative that evaluates how institutions treat people before titles are introduced," she explained. Richmond was one of several cities selected for observation. Ethan swallowed hard. This entire morning was an evaluation.
Victoria Nadith gently.
The evaluation was planned. The choices people made were their own. Nearby, several employees quietly lowered their eyes because they understood the importance of those words. Nobody had forced anything to happen. Nobody had created a trap. Human behavior had revealed itself naturally. Ethan finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Victoria looked at him kindly. Apologies matter when they become actions. That sentence landed heavily inside him. Because she was not trying to punish him. She was trying to teach him. The cool Virginia breeze moved through the American flag above them, while sunlight illuminated the entrance behind her. Victoria then said something nobody there would ever forget. "The way we treat strangers reveals our character long before we discover their importance." Everyone became silent again. Ethan nodded slowly because he finally understood the lesson. This was never about her title. She deserved dignity the moment she arrived. The title simply exposed what should have existed from the beginning. As supervisors opened the doors and prepared for the federal meeting inside, Ethan stood quietly beneath the morning sun, realizing that the most powerful person he had ever met was not powerful because she led the FBI. She was powerful because she chose compassion at the exact moment she had every reason to choose embarrassment instead. Real change does not happen the moment someone discovers the truth. Real change begins the moment they decide to live differently because of it. An hour later, the federal conference room inside the building was filled with senior officials, supervisors, and community representatives from across Richmond. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows while reports and notebooks rested neatly on polished wooden tables. Victoria Bennett stood near the front of the room, not as someone celebrating authority, but as someone guiding a conversation that could influence thousands of lives. Officer Ethan Parker sat quietly among everyone else. For the first time all morning, he was not trying to lead the room. He was trying to learn from it. Imagine realizing that the greatest lesson of your career arrived on a day you believed you were simply doing your job. Victoria looked around and said, "Today was never designed to identify bad people. It was designed to identify harmful habits before they become permanent." Several people immediately nodded. Others wrote down every word. Ethan remained focused because he understood something now that he had never fully understood before. Assumptions do not appear all at once. They are built through repetition. Victoria continued, "The most dangerous systems are not created overnight. They are created when certainty becomes more important than curiosity." The room became silent. Nobody could disagree because everyone had experienced moments where they had relied on assumptions instead of facts. A community representative raised her hand and asked, "How do we begin changing that culture?" Victoria smiled softly. "We begin by slowing down long enough to see people before we see categories." Ethan immediately wrote that sentence inside his notebook. Nearby, several supervisors exchanged thoughtful glances, because they understood this lesson extended far beyond law enforcement. It applied to schools, businesses, hospitals, and everyday interactions. Victoria then displayed anonymous data collected from multiple cities. The patterns looked similar everywhere. Tiny assumptions eventually produced larger problems. That was exactly why her initiative existed. Ethan finally raised his hand. The room turned toward him. He took a deep breath and said, "If someone realizes they have been making assumptions for years, what is the first step toward becoming better?" Victoria looked directly at him. "Humility. Because humility creates space for learning." He slowly nodded. Those words settled deep inside him. Outside the windows, Richmond continued moving through its ordinary day. Families walked through parks. Employees returned to their offices. Children laughed on school playgrounds. Life continued because ordinary people were exactly who these institutions were built to protect. Victoria gathered her notes and said something everyone would remember long after this meeting ended. Every person deserves dignity before they introduce themselves. Nobody spoke for several seconds because everyone understood the weight behind that sentence. Ethan closed his notebook and quietly repeated those words to himself. For years, he believed experience made him effective. Today, he discovered that empathy would make him better. The cool Virginia sunlight illuminated the room as everyone prepared to continue their work. But nobody would leave unchanged. Because sometimes the greatest authority is not the person who holds the highest title. It is the person who turns a painful moment into a lesson strong enough to transform an entire community. 3 weeks later, the lesson that began on a quiet Richmond sidewalk had started reaching places nobody expected. Early that morning, sunlight poured across the Federal Administration building, while employees entered with a noticeably different energy. Doors were held open. Greetings came before procedures. Conversations began with curiosity instead of assumptions. The changes were small, but they were consistent. And consistency was exactly how culture transformed. Victoria Bennett returned to Richmond for a follow-up review, carrying the same leather portfolio beneath her arm, and wearing the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning. As she walked through the entrance, nobody reacted because of her title. They welcomed her because respect had become part of the environment itself. Imagine entering a building where people no longer wait to discover who someone is before treating them with kindness. That was the future quietly taking shape. Inside a conference room, teachers, community leaders, business owners, and public servants gathered around large tables to discuss long-term improvements. Officer Ethan Parker was there too, but he was no longer sitting silently in the background. He was participating. He had volunteered to help create a new community engagement program, designed to strengthen trust between institutions and the people they served. Victoria listened while he addressed the room. "For years, I believed experience alone would guide my decisions," he said. "Today I understand that experience without curiosity can become a limitation." Several people nodded immediately. A local teacher smiled and wrote the sentence inside her notebook. Victoria quietly observed because she understood something important was happening. The lesson was no longer hers to carry. It was becoming everyone else's responsibility. Nearby, a large screen displayed 3 simple principles: curiosity before conclusions, respect before assumptions, humanity before titles. Nobody questioned those ideas because everyone had already seen their impact. Outside the windows, Richmond continued its ordinary rhythm. Families visited parks. Students walked home from school. People gathered at local cafes. Yet invisible changes were spreading throughout the community. Ethan approached Victoria after the meeting ended and said, "I never realized how many decisions we make automatically every day." She smiled softly. "Awareness is the beginning of transformation." He nodded. "Then perhaps communities become stronger one habit at a time."
Victoria smiled.
Exactly one habit at a time. The cool Virginia breeze moved gently through the trees outside while sunlight illuminated the streets below. Employees leaving the building naturally greeted strangers without hesitation. It no longer felt forced. It felt normal. That was the true success of the initiative. Victoria gathered her notes and prepared to leave for the day. Before she walked away, she looked back one final time at the building where everything had begun. It looked exactly the same. Yet entirely different hearts now occupied that space. Ethan stood near the entrance and quietly said, "Amazing how one ordinary morning changed so many lives."
Victoria smiled warmly.
It was never an ordinary morning. It was an opportunity disguised as a lesson. Together they looked toward the Richmond skyline as the afternoon sun slowly moved westward. Because the greatest victory was never revealing that she was the FBI chief. The greatest victory was building a future where nobody would ever need an important title to receive the dignity they deserved from the very beginning. 6 months later, people in Richmond no longer remembered that morning as an embarrassing incident outside a federal building. They remembered it as the beginning of a better future. The Federal Administration Building still stood beneath the Virginia sky exactly where it had always been, but the people inside had changed. Employees greeted visitors before asking questions. Officers introduced themselves before discussing procedures. Community partnerships had grown stronger because trust was no longer treated as a goal. It had become a habit. Early one spring morning, Victoria Bennett returned to Richmond for one final review before transferring her attention to another city. She walked through the entrance carrying her familiar leather portfolio and immediately noticed something beautiful. Nobody rushed. Nobody hesitated. A security officer smiled and said, "Good morning. Welcome." Those simple words made her smile because they represented months of progress. Imagine changing an entire culture through one lesson that began with a single decision to choose dignity over assumptions. Inside a conference room, Officer Ethan Parker stood in front of a new group of officers beginning their careers. He no longer spoke with the certainty he once carried. Instead, he spoke with wisdom. He pointed toward a message displayed on a large screen. Curiosity before conclusions. Respect before assumptions. Humanity before titles. Then he said, "Never make someone earn the right to be treated fairly. They already have that right the moment they stand in front of you." The room became silent because every person understood the importance of those words. Across the room, Victoria listened quietly. She never wanted recognition. She never wanted people to remember her title. She wanted people to remember the lesson. Outside, Richmond continued moving through another ordinary day. Families gathered in parks. Students walked home from school. Business owners opened their stores. Life looked peaceful because communities become stronger when ordinary people choose better habits every day. Ethan eventually walked outside and stood beside Victoria near the entrance where everything had first begun. He looked toward the skyline and smiled. It is hard to believe one morning changed so much.
Victoria smiled softly.
Great change rarely arrives with loud announcements. It grows through small decisions repeated over time. He nodded. Then perhaps every community has hope. She looked toward the city and answered, "Every community has hope when people become willing to see humanity before identity." The cool Virginia breeze moved through the trees while sunlight reflected across the building windows. Employees leaving work greeted strangers naturally without thinking about it. That was the greatest victory of all. Kindness no longer felt unusual. It felt normal. Victoria gathered her portfolio and prepared to leave Richmond behind for the final time. Before walking away, she paused and looked back one last time. The same building stood there. The same sidewalks remained. But entirely different hearts now occupied those spaces. Ethan